So I'm Patrick Crowley. I'm going to talk about Trucker, which is basically lets you migrate stuff. So let's talk about migrating a little bit. In general, I kind of think of migrating as kind of going from suck to less suck. And that can be PHP to Rails, Perl to Rails, Java to Rails, or even Rails to Rails. Basically, migrating is kind of a pain. You develop a new site, you migrate data, and then you deploy your new site. The migrate data step in particular might be something like this. Dump your database, drop some tables, rename attributes, tweak data by hand or in some automated way, import data into a new app, and then pray things are OK. And typically, that's so painful, you just do it once. And that definitely sucks. So it's labor intensive, it's error prone, and like I just said, it's kind of a one-way trip, typically. You just don't want to do it very often because it is painful. So Trucker is kind of a gem for making migrating legacy data suck less. It was written by myself and Rob Kaufman. The idea behind Trucker is that you can migrate data from day one. And I literally mean day one, like the day you build your new app that's going to contain some of your legacy data, you can start migrating legacy data that day, which really allows you to sort of improve your data over time. Not just migrate once, but migrate continually as you develop your new app that's going to contain some data from your legacy app. And then when you finally do launch, you can kind of launch with confidence. Unlike just doing it once, where you'd sprawl with errors, it may or may not work, and that's kind of it. With this, you kind of feel much better about launching your new app. So Trucker is pretty simple. It's really just rake and some legacy classes and a migration helper. So let's kind of get started and kind of show you how to install Trucker and use it. Just do gem install Trucker. Add config.gem Trucker to your Rails app. And by the way, this is all kind of Rails 2.3. I'm not really going to deal with Rails 3 right now. It's not quite out yet. So once you've added the Trucker gem to your configuration, you just want to do script generate truck. The truck is the thing that's going to move the data for you. And this is kind of the output of that. So you can see, basically, when you generate a truck, you're generating a legacy directory in your app models directory. That's where you're going to store your legacy models. You're going to create a base legacy class, which really is just there to connect to your database and provides a really simple migration method. And then we also add a legacy rake task. And we append a legacy adapter to your database YAML. And then we also add a new load path to your environment. So I'll kind of go through those specifically, just so you can see what happens. So with your environment, there's the new load path. So we're storing everything in app models legacy. And we do that because we don't want to really pollute the normal namespace with your other models, particularly because at some point you probably won't need to migrate legacy data once it's already migrated over. So that way you can kind of just take that whole directory and nuke it at some point down the road. So the other thing here is we're adding a legacy adapter, which is just the connection information to our legacy database. By convention, I tend to name these things whatever my app name is, _legacy. Of course, this might change depending on what your particular database situation is like. And I should say, Trucker really is meant for kind of active record-based apps. There are more advanced ways to do this kind of stuff with Data Mapper, but Trucker is sort of for the simple case, or the simple to moderate case. So here's the legacy base model. Basically, it's just connecting to your legacy adapter that we just defined. And then it's just got a really simple migrate method that helps us create new records for each of our legacy records. So in a typical app, let's say we've got a app that's got blog posts, we've got some legacy blog posts that are stored somewhere. We would create a legacy post model, which is a subclass of legacy base. And the first thing we would do is we would set our table name to whatever our particular table name is in our old legacy database. And then the important thing here is we're defining a map method, which basically is just a hash that has essentially the new fields we want to save to, and then the old values from our legacy data. So in this example, we're grabbing like the old headline, we're squishing it, and we're also grabbing the body and doing the same thing. So this is a really simple example, just sort of saying, okay, field A is going to be field B or C in the new app. But you can easily build on this. So as a really simple example, here's the helper method below, where we're essentially tweaking the name of our blog post to correct any typos where people misspell V. But you can take that same idea and make pretty sophisticated methods to tweak data. And that's definitely pretty important. If you are migrating something that's old to something that's new, you do have a lot of like, hey, we just need to subtly change this or that. And just this simple technique allows you to really wreak havoc on your legacy data and make it really awesome. And just one more point to make about this legacy post model. The idea with this is we'd actually have a post model in our regular app that we're trying to migrate to. And so we'd always call this model legacy post. It doesn't really matter what your model was called in the old app. It's kind of irrelevant. We just want to connect to it and map the fields over, maybe tweak a couple things, and then move on. So the next part of Trucker thing it generates is this legacy rake task. It's just appending to the DB migrate namespace. So in this simple example, we just have a new task, which is called posts. And you can see that we're using the trucker migrate method. We're just saying trucker migrate post. So pretty simple. So with that said, let's do some migrating. Again, an important step not to forget is to actually import your legacy database if you're doing this in development, or if you're connecting to a remote database, just make sure that that's accessible to you. So once we've set all that stuff up, we just go to our terminal and we run rake db migrate posts. And this is what the output would be. In this case, we're just migrating 10 blog posts. Pretty straightforward. You can see that Trucker gives you some nice feedback on kind of where you are in the process, particularly if you have lots of records. I should say I've used Trucker to migrate several 100,000 records, so it works pretty well. If you have more than that, you may not want to use it. You might want something else. But it works very well for sort of small to medium apps. So this rake task also has a couple of parameters you can pass to it. So you can limit the number of records you're migrating. You can use an offset. And you can also delete all the records, all the existing ones you've already migrated. So an example of that would be, there's some migrations you may only want to do 500 or 1,000 at a time for a particular reason, just so you can kind of see how the import's working, see what's there, that kind of thing. And then other times you may just want to totally nuke what's there. So with that said, let me just do a quick demo. It's basically the same code I've just shown you, but we'll kind of tool around the app so you can see what it's like. All right, just give me a second here. Okay, so this is our Trucker sample app. This is actually on GitHub, so if you get confused, this is all available to you. So we have a pretty simple model here. We've got just a This is just our fake little blog app, so it's got a post model. And then you can see there's a legacy folder. So when we ran script generate truck, we added this legacy base. You don't need to screw with this at all. And then we've got our legacy post model right here. So we've set the table name. That's the right thing in our old database. We've got the map here. That's there. And then if we look in our tasks folder, here's the legacy rake task. Also pretty simple. So let's just look at this app in Safari right now. If I can bring my window over. So this is our new app. If I reload, we have no blog posts right now. So I'm going to jump in the terminal here, and I will do rake db migrate posts. So we just migrated 10 blog posts. And let's go back to Safari here and reload. So there are 10 blog posts. Pretty straightforward. So a couple more advanced things you can do with Trucker. You can use the helper method to do custom migrations. So there are cases where you might want really sophisticated logic when you're migrating stuff. So in that scenario, you can kind of override the typical Trucker migration behavior and just write your own method to iterate through the legacy records however you want and do whatever you need to do. So a good example of this might be if you need to parse text files, CSV, that sort of thing. That's a way to do it. And so, beyond that, there's certainly, I think, to some extent, when you've got legacy apps and data you want to bring over, you always have an edge case. So this doesn't, solve all of your edge cases. You'll still have to do some development on this. So I sort of say Trucker helps you move, but you still have to pack your stuff up. So that's basically it. So some resources for you guys. The source code for Trucker is on GitHub, as is the sample app. And lastly, I want to thank Dave Thomas, who sort of pioneered this technique a couple years ago in a blog post. And I've been using it to migrate several different sites here and there. But it just seemed like it was time to kind of make a gem out of it. It might be more useful.
Patrick, can you?
We have a question here.
Now that you've gone through that,
Yeah, sure.
could you go through the use case of when you would use Trucker? When specifically you had blog post was the original table.
Right.
You're migrating all that to now to post.
Uh-huh.
And just now that we've seen that, if you give me the example of when you're going from one app to another or modifying an app where this really comes in handy.
Sure. So
I think it was basically probably your first slide or two, but now that I've seen this, I
yeah.
remember what you said this was good for.
So I have a site that I'm working on. It's been working on it for a while. It's basically a database of movie theaters. Okay, and so the current site is kind of like a crappy PHP app. And we've been working for a while on rebooting it as a Rails app. So if you look at our legacy models here, we have a lot of different models in this old app that we want to bring over, right? So an example would be, a movie theater has an architect, right? So we have an architect model. We want to kind of bring that in, but maybe in this case we are changing the name of our fields, right? We're going from name first to first name and name last to last name. So in this case, we're just sort of swapping things, right? So on the left, we have the attributes in our new class, right? And on the right, we have the values from the legacy data that's there. So that's a really simple example. But the sort of primary object for this site, not surprisingly, is a theater. That's the sort of main model. And so you can see we have a much larger map, right? So we're bringing in a ton of stuff. And then we also have some particular sort of helper methods we're using here, right? It can get kind of crazy. And as another example of that, if you look at our rake task for migrating this, a lot of these are really simple, like trucker migrate architects, trucker migrate chains, and so on. But the theater one is a little bit crazy, so we wrote like well, this is another example, actually. We did one for joins. You know, if you had like a bunch of join tables you need to migrate in and maybe tweak them somehow. So I wrote a bunch of custom code for that. And then with the theaters in particular, we're just doing a lot more stuff with the migration and where we want to maybe be really conscious of what's failing or not working. So I kind of broke it out. So in that way, you know, if you wanted to write your own custom helper here for the rake task, you can kind of look at the way the existing one works just in the source code. Essentially, it's just sort of saying, hey, legacy model, let's loop through that. And for each record we find, let's create a new record with our current model. Does that make sense?
That's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Any other questions?
So not in all cases you need to test, but something that's pretty complicated like that, it might be kind of useful to make sure that the data is going over and all these different edge cases.
Right.
Do you have any experience with testing this and how we go about that?
I haven't actually done much like legitimate testing with it. The simplest testing I do is just that with any one of these things, when I'm running like the rake migrate, rakedb migrate post or something like that, I might run that hundreds of times before we actually deploy the new app. So that's the simplest way of testing, just where you can kind of really run through and see what's working, what's not working. And there are a lot of things where it might work instantly the first time you turn it on because it's migrating stuff. But then once you do that, you might go, hey, you know what? Like the body text in our blog post is sort of screwed up here and there. It'd be really cool if we could fix it. And so a good example of this would be, so we have this old site that's got blog posts that links to different records, but it's like a totally different path, right? The link's not the same, but we want to preserve all those links in the new app, right? So you could write a helper method to go through and update any links in blog posts that are internal links, and find them and tweak them and get them in the right format. But certainly, I think you could use our spec to test this stuff more rigorously, and it would be pretty sweet. Anyone else?
How does it deal with associations? Or does it?
It sort of punts on that, in the sense that you can kind of so say you have like blog post categories, right? You'd write you add a class, right, to import all of your categories. In terms of like join tables and stuff like that, so far I've only done just sort of custom helpers for that. So there's really nothing specific in Trucker that deals with that right now. But it certainly would be nice. So if anyone wants to contribute that, that would be great. But sometimes with legacy data, you don't need to replicate the entire app, probably. You just need to bring in part of it. So the parts I've mostly had to deal with are relatively simple, right? Anyone else? All right, cool. Thanks.